strand of utopianism might come close to Paul Gilroy's idea of planetary humanism, a global solidarity against racism and all types of essentialism through increased conversation. And so, in this way, it's also reminiscent of Leela Gandhi's study of effective communities in the 19th century, which underpins a more utopian vision of the world, even in the 19th century. Two global projects are the West-East Divan Orchestra, co-founded by Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim, and the new social movements such as the World Social Forum. And Lisa Mooney-Smith has also told me of another one for Bosnia-Herzegovinian refugees in the East Midlands who are growing their own crops on the allotments, and then through an exchange with allotment growers on the outskirts of Dubrovnik are returning to Bosnia-Herzegovina while the allotment growers come to the East Midlands to compare the different types of production. These kinds of projects are usually done outside national boundaries and through collaborations of a more personal affiliation. There is therefore a new utopian turn in post-colonial studies, emerging partly as a response to the impact of globalization and the pervasiveness of neo-imperial ideologies. Utopianism is one strand of transnational cosmopolitanism, reflecting the increased mobilization both within and between cultures and nations, and the need for a more engaged dialogue with the other. But this is neither abstract or theoretical, because it participates in discourses which are politically informed. As such, it is pragmatic and ethical, articulating a practical project that translates in the terms of Ernst Bloch into, quote, the intention towards the possibility that has still not become. This gives postcolonialism the possibility of being an anticipatory discourse, one which, in the view of the British critic Patrick Williams, who uses the term in relation to the condition of Palestine and the hope that prevails there, as articulated by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, the hope that it will bring about a better world. Such a utopian post-colonial cosmopolitanism offers a conceptual basis for a new disciplinary framework, which is required now that nations and states are no longer seen as stable and clearly demarcated entities. Next slide, please. I now turn to the question of how a post-colonial pedagogy might be reshaped by the new forces of globalization. The new interrogation of the practice of post-colonial criticism within the institutional location hinges on the issue of how one performs post-colonial studies. It is not what we do, but how we do it. Given the discrepancy, as I've already mentioned, between the objects of inquiry and the institutional position from which the critique is being articulated, this position is now more urgently under scrutiny as new pedagogical practices are required. Once again, the ground is shifting with the expansion of the disciplinary base provided by globalization. Diana Bryden advocates a post-colonial epistemology in which research and education are made ethically relevant, and she argues the previous post-colonial concerns with national liberation should be redirected into contemporary justice, educational and equity movements which operate at the scales below and beyond the nation-state. This kind of politically oriented, pedagogically relevant knowledge inquiry can be brought about by judicious educational policies which bring together diverse research practices, curricular choices, and concrete areas of engagement, such as the sort that we are engaged in here. She offers the example of the Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, Canada, to show how institutional knowledge acquired in schools and universities can both inform and be influenced by larger projects of public education. Bryden's project, inquiry and recommendations are made against the backdrop of what she argues are the accumulated cracks in the world imaginary, and I refer to the second point on the slide, partly due to the weakening of the national cultural imaginaries and their underpinning structures of world capitalism and liberal thought. One such example is the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of neoliberal globalization. Another is the rise to economic power of the BRIC group, Brazil, Russia, India and China, with a subsequent shift of economic power in other spheres and a reminder that post-colonial studies is not just an Anglophone endeavour. A third is the reverse colonization, or what some call the reverse globalization phenomenon, which is migrations back to the first world nations, necessitating consideration of the role of multi-faith and multicultural communities within the nation-state. She sees such cracks as bringing the post-colonial into new spaces of thinking and into closer alignment with the arguments of other disciplinary communities, as well as different historical contexts and geographical spaces. Pedagogical practices are therefore in need of further development. Bryden advocates an education able to reconcile the desire to foster individual autonomy and the responsibility to critique entrenched systems of inequality at a collective global level. Postcolonial studies, she suggests, might engage in more relational and transcultural forms of inquiry, whereby distinct forms of individuation and political agency can enter the dialogue. And she reminds us that only by entering into uncomfortable dialogues, both within and across disciplines, can the postcolonial refashion itself as a rhizomatic paradigm, an interpretive framework that can come to inform wider public projects such as education policies or ethnographic or museological practices. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I will briefly outline a snapshot for the future of areas where the postcolonial enterprise might develop new areas of inquiry and cross-disciplinary modes of engagement. First of all, widening the canon. Postcolonial should reroute itself into a multilingual field because non-Anglophone writers and vernacular literatures are underrepresented due to the favouring of a relatively small range of postcolonial cosmopolitan writers whose work is published in largely metropolitan-based critical journals. The critique of Raymond Williams of the politics of modernism, that is, it is the metropolitan interpretation of its own processes as universals, might equally well be relevant to postcolonialism. So this entails a greater investment in translation studies and an embrace of languages other than English, Spanish or French. And it is particularly valuable and relevant to India, as we have been discussing here already, because of the plethora of indigenous languages and the lack of access and translation between them and into English and other global languages. Secondly, there's a need to engage more with the visual arts, with graphic art and design, photography and film, the third point on the slide. These can be interdisciplinary engagements, for example, looking at photography in particular text and political contexts, film in relation to diasporic communities. Third, postcolonialism should actually open up to time frames earlier than the contemporary and continue the earlier project of cultural recuperation with a more developed historical awareness, seeking to recover erased voices in moments of rupture which have been written out of earlier historical narratives. The consolidation of the discipline has meant that there's been some undermining of the historical urgency that came from the oppositional political energies that animated the decolonising intellectuals, the anti-colonial intellectuals in particular, of the earlier 20th century. Fourthly, it should continue to challenge the premises of regional or area studies, which often privilege national concerns and or networks of empire, as found in the concept of Commonwealth literature, by arguing for comparativist approaches and the inclusion of minoritorian groups, such as diasporic metropolitan communities. A second major area for development is in the strengthening of the interface between environmentalism and globalisation. There is a need to reinvigorate the ethical and aesthetic engagement with questions that historically constituted postcolonial theories' theoretical and political strength, and to develop an ethics of responsibility in relation to issues such as the environment, for example, in global warming, and into other issues such as essentialism and its various disguises, such as terrorism and the war on terror. There is a need to decouple globalisation from its neoliberal, neo-imperial structures and to embrace, for example, an alternative, social, ecologically aware position. As I hope I've made clear in my discussion of utopianism, postcolonial cosmopolitanism and postcolonial pedagogy, which constitute new directions from the discipline's earlier preoccupations with resistance and liberation, a postcolonialism as a set of practices and theories should increasingly be able to speak about what it is for rather than what it is against. What I want to emphasise finally is that postcolonialism has a positive, even utopian future, although we should not be complacent about this and we should not take it for granted. In the last decade, it has begun to redirect its theoretical energies and its critical inquiry in ways that preserve its dynamism, flexibility, critical force, and ultimately its cultural relevance. The critical project of regrounding of the discipline in a changing and increasingly globalised contemporaneity is ongoing, made with the view to strengthening and enhancing its theoretical and pedagogical impact in a comparative context. Thank you for your attention, and I should warmly like to thank Professor Sridhar Rajeswaran and Professor Avadash Kumar Singh for inviting me and Dr. Lisa Mooney-Smith to Baba Saheb Ambedkar Open University. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for such an enlightening talk. I'm sure, like me, for our students, it was an excursion in the field of post-colonialism. Now the session is open for a very brief discussion, since we're running short of time. I'll request our students, if they have any query, they can ask, please.
Lisa ma'am, I want to ask one question. You said that in the interdisciplinary innovation, there is an unusual partners like philosophy and corporate banking. I have some doubt that how philosophy and corporate banking can connect.
Can go together.
When you're bringing interdisciplinary partnerships together from unusual disciplinary areas, you have to have a level of discussion and debate and dialogue which helps to bring you closer and closer together. Sometimes it's not possible to do it swiftly, it takes a long time. And with philosophy and corporate banking, that's taken many years to get to a stage where they understand more about each other. And at that point, they find threads that move between each other, that they can find commonality. And one of those threads was rooted within the study of metaphysics. And obviously the aspect of metaphysics which is most resonant in banking is around things to do with causation and risk, and how corporate industry, particular fiscal industries, are able to manage their corporate risk and the way that they impact upon the individual's banking relationship. And philosophy had much to say about that, although they didn't recognise it as risk and causation, they recognised it as metaphysics. But through dialogue, they were able to find out and translate for each what that meant in different environments.
We have a question from Ahmedabad. Please.
Yeah, hello. Hello.
Hello. Go on.
Hello?
Hello.
Surbi, say.
Please go on.
In fact, I compliment both the speaker, Dr. Smith and Dr. Wilson, particularly the second presentation elicits a few responses. One question that comes to my mind is that we speak about local sensibility. Will it not be proper to think in terms of global sensibility, that is local plus global? And second thing is that the kind of post-colonialism that we are aiming for, at times it tends to be a kind of utopia, or at times it appears to be a sort of comparative in integrated studies that we are moving for, because it tries to include everything in it. Therefore, when we say it is not against, it is for something and not against. And what is for tends to be against something. That's the issue. So a few responses are needed regarding this. Okay, thank you.
Well, I did point out that post-colonialism has not lost its resistance in this sort of traditional sense that it was conceived of. And this, I think, has been part of its institutionalization because it has introduced a reading practice which encourages readers to look for types of power structures and texts, signs of what we might call neo-globalization or imperialism, and to uncover that and to resist it. This is one of the areas of utopian cosmopolitanism that I was talking about. So it has perhaps moved from being a more political resistance on the ground to a more discourse-based resistance. Your other point about being too diversified and being too broadly based now to be meaningful, I think is a cautionary note indeed, and probably one worth pointing out. But I think this is part of the effects of globalization, that the disciplines are blurring into one another, and maybe that is not a bad thing, because what we're trying to do is articulate the ways in which those disciplinary boundaries are being crossed, and to produce new research perspectives from them.
Could I add to that particular point? Because also it is most important that we retain a sense of our disciplinary specificity, and that you have a grounding and a methodological underpinning which is rooted in your disciplinary specificity. From that point, you then have the freedom to be able to explore and move beyond those boundaries. But by having a strong foundation from your disciplinary specificity, you're able to wander and be confident about the challenges that you have.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. Can we have one last question from our students?
Sure.
Please.